You're listening to American Songcatcher. Today I have the pleasure of talking with Mr. Oliver Wood from the Wood Brothers. Oliver, how you doing today, sir?
I'm doing well, sir. Thank you. Thanks for having me today, Nicholas.
It's really nice to have you. So what was your childhood like? Does music run in your family?
Yeah. So my dad, his name's Bill Wood, and he uh, is by trade a retired science professor he's a molecular and cellular biologist. So he both made textbooks, taught as a college professor, and did a lot of research in his day, and now he's retired. However, he also was a very serious folk musician. So he's got a pre-war Martin guitar that he bought from a pawn shop when he was a teenager, and really got into folk music during the whole folk movement of the late 50s, early 60s.
Mm-hmm.
Went to Harvard, and so that was one of the big,
Yeah.
central places for that scene. He was close friends with Joan Baez and actually played on her first record, and had a radio show at Harvard, and was just a real music nerd, but a really great performer, who something we as kids sort of took for granted how great he was, but just around the house he would play around the in the living room, or play at people would come over, he would get out the guitar and just play a bunch of songs, and was a great performer and still knows hundreds of songs, especially things that were popular in that area, but in that era. But he also, like, since his retirement, has gotten much more. He's in his 80s, but he's back into playing and singing quite a bit, and writing protest songs, and so the hippie in him came back out in retirement. Yeah, so he was very musical, and I think we took it for granted as kids growing up around him, that everybody's dad does that, or whatever. It's not that big a deal. But he was the musical one, and both my brother and I played quite a bit of music when we were kids. Partly because of him, but partly because my parents just either made us take piano lessons, or we got excited about guitar, or in my brother's case, bass, and my dad's record collection too was a big influence too, because he listened to everything from classical music to blues and folk stuff, and bluegrass and rock and roll. That's where I found like Dylan records and Beatles records and things like that were.
Wow. So where did you grow up then? Did you guys grow up in Atlanta?
Oh no. I grew up. I was born in Southern California, in
Okay.
Pasadena, and when I was about 10, we moved to Colorado. My dad got a job at the University of Colorado, so we moved sort of we moved to Boulder, Colorado.
Okay.
So that's kind of where I spent formative years.
Did you guys have as kids, did you end up rebelling from all that music when you were teenagers? Most kids, when they get exposed to a certain kind of music when they're young, they seem to
Right.
want to do the exact opposite.
Yeah, I mean, to a point. It's the kind of thing where, yeah, I mean, we are definitely into rock and roll, where my dad's, was more into folk and classical music and bluegrass and stuff like that. I think, when I started playing music, I definitely got into Hendrix and Zeppelin and Albert King and B.B. King and things like that. But there's always things that you agree on, like the Beatles or something. It's very some sort of a crosses the generations, and you can
Right.
on. But I will say, I think what's interesting related to what you said is that when I was a kid, at no point did I really want to play folk music like what my dad did.
Mm-hmm.
Yet, as an adult, when we started the Wood Brothers, we kind of went back to that. My brother, played in the band Medeski Martin and Wood, which is a much more experimental jazz thing, and
Mm-hmm.
for which is a weak description, but in general. And I went into more. I had a 6-piece band when I lived in Atlanta. I did live in Atlanta for a long time.
Right.
But when my brother and I got back together, we started doing more. We were interested in breaking things down to smaller and acoustic, not necessarily all acoustic, but more folky, basically. So a lot more like we grew up with my dad just playing guitar. So it took, we had to come full circle back to appreciate what he was doing. So I was, in my late 30s by the time I really appreciated it and wanted to try something like that.
Seems to be such a running theme with people that I talk to. I was talking with Leah Song from Rising Appalachia, and she said the same thing. Her parents, or her mother especially, was a musicologist and taught them a lot of fiddle tunes and Irish folk music, Celtic music when they were little. And, they went the exact opposite direction and wanted to become a part of the hip hop scene for a while. And then they started infusing all of that with the old folk music they started growing up to. I know that that's a common theme. Gillian Welch did the same thing, where she had a long period of rebelling against the music that she was kind of exposed to early on.
The Avett Brothers come to mind. I just remember the first time I saw the Avett Brothers, they're almost like a punk band.
Yeah.
But then they sort of came back around to a more folky acoustic thing.
Right. It is interesting, and there's so many cyclical things about traditional music and folk music in general, but I think that's just one of the fascinating aspects of people that really get deep, that have parents that are deep into it early on.
Yeah.
So was guitar your second instrument then? You started with piano because you were forced to, and then it was guitar?
Yeah, guitar was my second instrument. It's funny because we talk about what we're talking about makes sense even in certain terms of guitar. Taught me guitar or could teach me guitar. Like, it's one of those things where I don't want to learn it from him. I don't think either of us consciously understood that, but my dad got me a guitar, but I just wasn't into it at the time. But I still got into it, just I had to get it from somewhere else,
Right.
I started playing guitar as a teenager, really, when I didn't get serious about it until I was pushing 20.
Did you have any mentors when you were getting started or playing, besides your dad, obviously?
Absolutely. Really, when I started playing in bands and stuff, I always had, I started out as kind of the young guy in the band, and so I count most of my mentors as people who just in those early days of playing gigs, when you play with the older guys, they're showing you how it's done, whether they're telling you or you're just watching them and it's by example.
Right.
But lots of mentors. When I was sort of my first road gig that I got was with a guy named Tinsley Ellis, who is a blues guitar player and singer out of Atlanta. And I was just a young guy just starting to play in bars, and he hired me to go on tour and as he calls it, be my rhythm slave and play rhythm guitar. But he was a fantastic mentor because he, he gave me the spotlight every once in a while. And at some point he said, you need to start singing one song a night. So he would let me sing a song and pushed me and supported me. And then when I wanted to start my own band, which was called King Johnson, that was the next thing I did. He was very supportive and so I learned a lot from him and got a lot of support. And then when I was in the band King Johnson, I was not really a singer yet, if I even still am yet. But at that point, I was very new to me. I was kind of a guitar nerd, and anyway, Chris Long was the guy that I started King Johnson with, and Chris was a little older than me, played bass, and was already a great singer and great songwriter too. And he's the one who allowed me to share the singing duties with him, although he was way more experienced and much better singer. But he encouraged me to sing more and also to write. He's the one who inspired me to write, because he had all these songs that he had written, and wow, that's really cool. And I really loved how he wrote the things that he wrote. And so anyway, he was really instrumental in me doing what I do and actually building confidence at it. Those are two big ones right there. But I really consider like a lot of just people that I played with and have played with. You know, my brother's a mentor, and
Mm-hmm.
Jano Rix, who's in the Wood Brothers with me. Those guys are mentors too, just by example. Just, you learn so much by trying to blend your style with other people and see
Mm-hmm.
how they do it. And I think you just absorb things. I mean, from bad jokes to licks to philosophy, and you know, we talk a lot about the philosophy of playing shows or of making music in the studio, and you learn a lot by just seeing how other people do it.
Yeah, it's like seems like a more spiritual or holistic way to go about it. And I'm sure musicianship too, it goes such a
Uh,
long it goes such a long way when you're, and you're right, and you can kind of be studying somebody while they're playing, and be totally inspired to change your style or to add some huge element to what you're doing, just because you feels, you resonate so much with what someone else is doing. And yeah, mentors could be big or small, I guess you're right.
yeah, and for that matter, I don't know if it's still called a mentor, but also there's sometimes you learn things you don't want to do. You know,
Yeah.
kind of like you said, you know, when we're kids, we react against things, or we go the opposite way. And so, I mean, people ask me sometimes about living in Nashville. What's that like? Is it like all country music and stuff and music business? And that's the stigma that Nashville has. Because there's a lot more to it. But I will say the positives of having, you know, real commercial music around, which I don't, is not my thing.
Yeah.
Um, but sometimes you need something to butt up against, you know, or
Hmm.
something, you know, in the same way that you know, free jazz was sort of a way to get away from anything more organized or poppy even,
Right.
or punk was to disco or whatever, you know, just sort of the go the opposite way and see where that takes you. Because
Yeah.
music is so much about choices and what choices you make, and you don't really know where you're going to get up, but you get where you're going to end up, but you often just know I don't want to go there, I don't want to go there. Let's see what's through this door, and
Right.
then you discover something new and create something or get inspired by something.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So was before King Johnson, were you kind of starting to experiment with some older styles, some more eclectic sounds, or was it more of like through your kind of time and experience with King Johnson where you started to do that?
I certainly with King Johnson, that's where we got. That's where I started to open up my mind as far, at least as far as you know, what can you do with sort of roots based music, because I still like all these traditions of blues and gospel and country and folk and Appalachian music and jazz, even all that stuff. I love the traditions of those things,
Mm-hmm.
and still and like to draw from them. But I also like the idea that I can make my own recipe somehow with those ingredients, you know. And I think that's what I started doing with King Johnson. We had, you know, anytime you have a group of people with different backgrounds, you're going to get different influences, and here's what they like, and this is what they add to the pot, and so it was fun to just to try to stretch the boundaries a little bit of roots music. And I hate to even label. I like that label better than some labels because it can encompass a lot of things, but I think it does imply that there's traditions that you're using, but
Yeah.
we're not stuck in them. We're trying to see what else can happen with them. It's still
Yeah.
marinated.
I think that's maybe one of the more inspiring things about traditional music is, if you go back and you look at how the different traditions link up with each other, you realize that you can continue creating tradition based on, and by doing exactly what you guys did of elaborating on them, by adding your own voice, by adding your own style. Um, it's a constantly evolving thing, you know?
Yeah, 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 absolutely. And then sometimes you just throw one other thing in there,
Hmm.
maybe that's not traditional, or that's from a tradition from the other side of the world.
Right.
Uh, Something that I got really into at one point, my brother turned me on to it, was African guitar playing. Like
Mm.
you're picking folk guitar players out of Africa who use a lot of this, use the same harmony that we do.
Hmm.
And some of the guitar players, the rudimentary playing is just the same C, G, and D, and that we use the shapes, but the rhythm
The
is
rhythm is, yeah.
like, whoa, that's something new and different. And I love that. And like you were saying, if you go back far enough, if you ever saw I guess is it a Ken Burns or a PBS thing on country music
Hmm. Ken
a
Burns.
couple years ago.
Hmm.
But if when it went way back, it was amazing how much African American heritage country music has, and that you just don't think of it that way.
Right.
And of course, uh, even that links back to the stuff that I'm talking about, where I got really into this one video series, like this on DVD that my brother gave me, or he might even have a VCR, where it was just all these folk guitar players from Africa that they all put their capos real high on the neck
Hmm.
and just played just C, G, and D and A, and just things that we play, open folk chords. Man, it was so inspiring. Especially there was a one guy named Daniel Kachamba.
Mm.
I just really loved and emulated poorly, but as is often the case when you try to copy something and you just can't quite get it, you come up with a bastardized version that's kind of cool too.
It's the American way.
Exactly.
Yeah, there's a good example of that. You know, Jimmy Rogers was uh, heavily influenced by being around the railroads from when his father was working there and hearing African Americans that were traveling through or that were working on the railroad playing their songs.
Yeah.
And then, you know, he's kind of considered the father of country music, and there's a lot of blues in his music.
Yeah.
And,
Oh,
you
absolutely.
know, people don't link those. You're right that it doesn't get linked together. And I mean, there's a big part of African American heritage that has been lost in country music that it luckily is being brought up again now by different musicians like Dom Flemons and Rhiannon Giddens, and people that are more preservationists are bringing to light, you know, obviously the history of the banjo and everything. Um, there's just so much to uncover. That's kind of, I mean, that's one of the main reasons I started this podcast, was to talk with people about it and to keep conversations going about it. So
Yeah.
glad that you're privy to that too.
Oh, I love this conversation.
So admittedly, I first heard of Sister Rosetta Tharpe through you guys' version of Up Above My Head. And
Nice.
then I ended up finding like that the video that she did in Britain. I believe it was in Britain, on the railroad tracks, and
Exactly. Yeah.
yeah, and then obviously like down this rabbit hole of Chuck Berry and Chicago blues styles and Mississippi blues styles.
Yeah.
Do you remember hearing her for the first time and what that experience was like?
Oh yeah, I remember. I'm pretty sure it was a YouTube video, but it was Up Above My Head, and there's a really great YouTube video where she has this big choir around her. It's just her with a white
Mm-hmm.
electric guitar, Gibson, and I don't remember if I just heard that audio or if I saw that video, because now I just have that vision that goes with it, or the image that goes with it. But yeah, and just thinking, what the heck is this? And then realizing how old it was and how it really does predate so much rock and roll guitar playing.
Mm-hmm.
And then I eventually watched a documentary about her. I don't know if you've seen that, but that's
Yeah.
really fascinating and interesting. What an interesting life she had. But yeah, I became a huge fan, and somewhere along the lines too, somewhere along the line, I got really into gospel music. I guess I've always just been into it on the fringes of it, and just things like that, where you hear some gospel music, but like it could easily be R&B, rock and roll. With Rosetta Tharpe, that was like rock and roll guitar
Mm-hmm.
playing anyway, like early rock and roll guitar playing. Um, but so often, there's a fine line between Ray Charles or Aretha Franklin, who both obviously came from a church tradition.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it's neat to hear it in different, in different eras and in different styles. I don't know if you
Absolutely.
ever got into a guy named, there's a guy from the Bahamas named Joseph Spence.
Yes. Yes.
I mean, that to me is the
The grunting and the
the grunting and so he's like for listeners who don't know, he's like a great finger picking style gospel guitar player who also sings, but he kind of just mumbles and has this mumbly
yeah, it's
voice.
almost like vocal bowls or
Yeah, he sounds like he's just, I don't know, drunk or something. But beautiful guitar playing, like amazingly
mm-hmm.
orchestrated, and always the same kind of out of tune. Like he's not quite in tune, but it's somehow consistently so, and so
Yep.
it's just so unique. But that's a great example of something that you know is a little bit more on the fringes of gospel or folk music, but it's so powerful and unique, and I don't know if it's because he was isolated in geographically. That
Mm-hmm.
that's how why I don't know. I don't know anything about him as his history. You might know something about.
I need to look into him more. I've found his recordings. I want to say 4 or 5 years ago. It was actually so when after I opened for you guys at Ponte Vedra Concert Hall about 3 years later, I got to open for Taj Mahal there too. And I talked with Taj afterwards, and I asked him if he knew Joseph Spence, and he said that he spent time with him.
Yeah.
And I was always wondering how Joseph. I mean, it's not exactly the same, but there's a lot of elements of Piedmont blues in his style and the way that he was phrasing his guitar. Playing the instrumental melody over the top of a syncopated bass. Kind of the
Yeah.
standard, equation you could say of Piedmont blues. And I just always wondered how if it was some recordings that got to him or if he just
Right.
developed on his own. But
Yeah.
there is, it's a similar quality to some Mississippi John Hurt recordings too, where his guitar is just slightly out of tune. And obviously he never used a tuner and was just, playing shows as it was. But there is an emotional raw quality to that when it works. And you don't have many artists today that can play an out of tune guitar and sound cohesive, with their guitar, with the singing. I do need to look.
Yeah. It's always amazing how people transcend that.
Mm-hmm.
And actually, I have a feeling that that our brains and ears have evolved to where that's less acceptable somehow. I have a feeling tuning was not as important at some point, especially in folk music.
Absolutely. There's always that saying of good enough for folk music if your guitar is just slightly out of tune.
Yeah.
So obviously we talked a little bit about how kind of the broad brush that you painted with the Wood Brothers and with other projects of folk, soul, gospel, jazz, blues, country music. And can you link back to some other pioneer artists that you discovered early on in life that helped you kind of like maybe some central figures that you guys think back and you're like, oh man.
Oh yeah. Well, definitely. You mentioned Taj Mahal. Like back when I was in King Johnson, I got really into Taj Mahal, who led me indirectly back to like Mississippi John Hurt, Elizabeth Cotton. Some of those songs I learned from hearing Taj play, but then I was like, "Whose song is that?" And he was really good, always good at citing, where the song came from. So checking out some of those people that he absorbed. Some of those were like definitely Mississippi John Hurt, Elizabeth Cotton. And what else? Like things that my brother and I discovered that we love. Like I'm Snooks Eaglin. Do you know about Snooks?
Yeah. The New Orleans Street Singer. I use that record every time I warm up for a show. I don't know what it is, but
that guy is to me, he's like and I think he used to call himself Little Ray Charles, but I'm a huge Ray Charles fan, but he's like the sort of raw street musician guitar player version of Ray Charles to me, in that he encompasses all the roots stuff. You know, he's got
Mm-hmm.
gospel, he knows jazz, he knows gospel and blues, and even old rock and roll and stuff. And he seemed to just like have a huge catalog of stuff he could draw from. But he was a big guy, and then we always also loved J.B. Lenore.
Never heard of him.
Oh, J.B. Lenore, blues guitar player and singer and great songwriter, who I don't know if he was on Chess Records, but some of his old recordings have like some of those players on them. Like Fred Belo is the drummer on some of his great albums. But you should check out J.B. Lenore. There's an album called Passionate Blues, which
Okay.
I think it's which may be a reissue of some older thing, but it's him just mostly solo,
Okay.
or just with a drummer. And great guitar player, real neat, unique high voice, kind of like Skip James or something
Mm-hmm.
like that. Really special, and rhythmically really special. Like he had these songs that he would play like a rhythm that's in between a shuffle and a straight groove.
Okay.
So like a shuffle is usually like a right,
Right.
and then a straight would be like. He would do this thing where it's straight, but it's swinging also, and in terms of rhythm,
Yeah.
Anyway, I was always fascinated by that, and Jano actually, the drummer with the Wood Brothers, he loves that kind of beat. We've really gotten into that kind of
cool
stuff like that. Made huge impressions, and I was always really, as an electric guitar player early on, I loved B.B. King, Freddie King, Albert King. Robert Johnson, Lonnie Johnson. So that's why the band I was in was called King Johnson, because we loved all the Kings and all the Johnsons that were. But yeah, it was later on that I discovered like the finger pickers and the more Delta or Piedmont things.
Mm-hmm.
I had a serious jazz phase. I mean, I loved Wes Montgomery and Django and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Charlie Christian. It's been a while, but those were all things that I tried to study a little bit.
You want to play something that falls kind of in that inspiration category?
Yeah. Well, so I have a couple. Strangely, I put a couple covers on my new album, and they are old gospel songs, and things that I've sort of reinterpreted musically a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
But that I learned, like this song that I was going to start with, it's called "Needed Time," and I learned it from Lightnin' Hopkins, who's known sort of as a blues guy.
Mm-hmm.
Doesn't always play gospel songs, but again, it's sort of that bridge between the two, or that link. But I had a little side project, just a little blues gig that I used to do in Atlanta with some guys called Burnt Bacon, and this is a song that my friend John Liebman turned me on to. Anyway, feels like this. And what I also liked about Lightnin' Hopkins was how he would play oftentimes an acoustic guitar with a pickup in it going through an amplifier. So that's kind of what I'm doing today in his honor. And if the sound is rough, you can stop me and I can start over. Jesus, won't you come by here? Jesus, won't you come by here? Jesus, won't you come by here? Now is needed time. Now is needed time. Now is the need. you don't stay long, even if you don't stay long, even if you don't stay long. Now is needed time. Now is needed time. Now is the needed time. Now is needed time. Now is needed time. Now is the needed time.
Or just, what do you think made you want to put those songs on the record?
Well, that one,
Other than the fact that it's
that's
a
a
gorgeous
good,
song.
it's a good, pandemic / social upheaval, a good 2020 song, even though we're a little past 2020, but we can still have the aftertaste for
Oh
sure
yeah. Oh yeah.
of all kind of things that went on. So I don't know. I've always loved the song, but it became especially, became especially like seemed like the right kind of cover to these.
And gospel music in general. What do you think it is about gospel music that draws you in?
Well, I think it's a real pure form, or at least it certainly can be a very pure form of folk music. Like it starts out as not even for entertain. It's not for entertaining people necessarily at all. It's for connecting and being together,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's on a porch or at home or in a church. And I didn't grow up going to church, so I don't play it for spiritual reasons necessarily. I love the tradition of it, but I think of it as just part of the web of folk music that includes Appalachian music and blues music and a lot of these traditions that came together from different cultures, but not necessarily we're not necessarily part of the music business. Of course, they all become part of the music business, but they all are sort of. It's like folk art. It has that same rawness that if you find something that somebody wasn't planning to play for or exposed to the world, it was just for like writing a poem or a love song for your partner or something that's just heartfelt and local,
Mm-hmm.
and often has the purest emotion in it. So I
Mm-hmm.
think that's what draws me to all that sort of folk music. And it's interesting. I mean, as we talk about this, it makes me think about, well, why do I like the Rolling Stones or people who or like me who basically didn't steal that music but are just doing a different version of it and like getting paid for it, some more than others, but
Mm-hmm.
it's interesting to think about the things that ruin music are also the things that can ruin music, are also the things that some of us are doing for a living. So it's a little bit of a conflict of interest when I think about what I love about pure music.
Mm-hmm.
But too late now. Just got to roll.
Can being the operative word there, I think. Well,
Yeah.
that's interesting because, so much of that folk music that came over with the immigrants from the 1600s and the 1700s did come from hymn books. A lot of the folk songs that they came over and brought, from their heritage.
Like European hymn books.
Yeah, European hymn books. And then when it came to Appalachia, they're kind of mixing and mashing of these styles, and then people that were kind of anti-religion or were supposedly, more on the fence, and the kind of the mixing of those styles too.
Yeah.
I do think there is some sort of, I'm not religious either, and I would consider myself more spiritual, I guess, but I would love to go and just listen to a full blown choir or go into a Southern Baptist church and just
Oh yeah, it's nothing
bask
like that.
Yeah, just bask in it. And I think there, I don't know what it is. I think maybe there's some primal sort of reaction to hearing that, because there is some emotion there that if you're listening, you can pick up on. And I think most of the time that's what you're looking for in music anyways, is some way to connect with it. And sometimes it's emotion, sometimes it's a rhythm, sometimes it's, maybe an escape. But that's one of
Yeah.
those things that really draws you in, well, at least draws me in to a point where I feel something that I don't necessarily agree with in the church realm, but it's something that makes me feel comfortable or comforted.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. And I feel like ultimately the best thing about music is how it just connects. You know, it's
Mm-hmm.
just a connector. It's a kind of language that even if you're not a musician, that you can understand and be communicated to. And um, and so it's that connection. I mean, I've talked to a lot of people about what we miss most about not touring, and yeah, playing the music for sure, but it's also just that connection that happens when everybody is there and involved, and the audience is involved too. It's part of the group experience, and it's that time where nothing else matters. It doesn't matter what religion or politics or anything. It's just like we're all in this moment with these sounds.
Mm-hmm.
We're all relating, and that's probably the ultimate thing about gospel music too. For me,
Right.
that's what it's for, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess the religion part is arguable, but still, you're not even you're it puts everybody in a happy trance, you know. That's what it's about.
Right. I think, well, so you mentioned earlier that you and Chris kind of came back to a point of like, after he was with Medeski Martin and Wood, you're with King Johnson, where you kind of realized maybe you wanted to simplify things. Do you think it was like you were both just ready for a change, and you thought maybe we should play music together, or was it something else that inspired both of you to kind of decide to get back into the old kind of traditions of folk music or of blues and that stuff?
It was a little of both. I don't want to say we wanted to be more traditional, because we also wanted to experiment and see what can two guys do. You
Of
know,
course.
what can two guys pull off? Because there was only two of us when we started out.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but I think we were inspired by the idea of simplicity uh, and downsizing and independence, and that's kind of what I liked about it. It's like complicated when you have six people in a band and they all have different personalities and quirks and ideas, and it's fun and it's wonderful with the right people. But even with the right people, it takes a lot of energy, and I guess it just felt different and cool to strip it down to nothing. And so I don't even know how conscious it was, but it certainly felt like new ground, somehow to try to conquer. So, but the other thing that it did for my brother and I is, I feel like subconsciously the purpose of us doing the Wood Brothers was for us to reconnect and be close.
Mm-hmm.
We had lived in different. He lived in the Northeast. I lived in the Southeast. We were apart for a while. We grew apart musically, but we grew apart socially too, and as brothers. So we were kind of disconnected.
Mm-hmm.
And but we had both been off for 10 or 12 years making music and growing up and sort of figuring out who we were. So it was it was really nice for us to connect and bond over the music and reconnect as brothers, and that was half the purpose of it, I think, too. But it was also an opportunity because we had uh, Chris had already built quite a career. I was still struggling and playing in bars, but I had written a bunch of songs and I was ready for people to hear them and for them to get out in the world. And so that was kind of my contribution. And so anyway, it was kind of just a new venture that we were both excited about, and the fact that it was stripped down and seemed more traditional than what we were doing was cool, because it was, we always got hired for like bluegrass festivals and stuff, but we were never bluegrass at all, not even close. And I love bluegrass, but I can't flat pick worth a dang. So, and Chris had the upright bass, and I was playing either a national guitar, acoustic guitar, or electric guitar with a tiny amp like this one I have here, and so it's kind of fun that it was not quite categorizable. That's the word.
Yeah.
We like that too. It's got this guy's great bass player, but he can play jazz. Sometimes he's bowing, and sometimes he's playing like Charles Mingus, and other times he's playing like Willie Dixon or something. So anyway, it's fun just to mix it up.
So when Chris obviously kind of started developing under Medeski Martin and Wood, and you were developing under King Johnson, when you came together, what was like, you both had very different backgrounds at that point to come together and say, like, what was your mutual ground? What was your...
Well, we did have really different backgrounds, but if you go way back, we had the same. Like and even Medeski Martin and Wood, that whole band will tell you, they were also listening to blues and gospel, and things that I was really into. They just also were listening to world music and Sun Ra and stuff like that, which, my brother turned me on to a lot of that stuff. So, so I guess you're right. That when we got together, we were able to turn each other on to some stuff, like check out this guy, or this band, if you haven't heard of them. And we both brought that to the table, and that was fun to be able to share what we'd learned over the last 10 years and what we picked up. But then also to go back to, remember that Lightning Hopkins album that our dad had, or Jimmy Reed, or things like that. My dad had some of those things, or he had a Bob Dylan record, and we got back into that stuff, which we, was kind of buried in our past too, but our mutual past.
Did you actually go back to the records themselves, or did you just kind of rehash?
Oh no, we did go back to the records, and I remember us getting out the Jimmy Reed and Dylan records, and Sonny and Brownie and things like that my dad used to have, that we loved.
So are you still kind of diving into the past to influence the newer songs that you're making under your own kind of solo record and your kind of solo project?
Always. And sometimes it's not that far in the past, but it definitely, I love, sometimes it's cool to sort of think, well, what would Alan Toussaint do, or what would somebody, New Orleans, Dr. John do, or Cleveland for that matter, or think about Memphis or Stax and Russell Shoals, or when you're making records that are band related. But yeah, I still think about that stuff all the time, and I always love hearing different people's interpretations of those musics, and then discovering people who are in the cracks. Like I think a lot of people discovered an album about 2 or 3 years ago by Bobby Charles. Like a New Orleans singer-songwriter who made an album with the band.
Okay.
It was produced by Rick Danko, I think, but the band backed him up, and he made a great album. It's just called Bobby Charles, I think, and it's made in like 1970. It's an amazing album. It's so good, and just to discover little things like that never made the mainstream, even the musician mainstream. It's kind of fun to find things like that and turn them on to people.
Yeah, I think that's one of my more favorite things about talking with people today, is discovering, who's giving or citing credit to certain people and exposing it to the next generation. And, it's so bizarre with kind of this whole the sea shanties upheaval that's happening with the young mainstream culture. And I think like anytime that the next generation or the after me or the one after that, if necessary, that they can be exposed by an artist today that is crossing over different genres. Like, Billy Strings is a good example of somebody who's really cited a lot of people in his work and is really, I mean, in my opinion, he's humbled himself a lot more than the last few years. And he's really, really exposed a lot of folks to not only traditional bluegrass, but a lot of other genres and people as well that really need to be cited and need to be uprooted so that people get exposed to their music. And
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and I gotta say that's something I regret for myself that I like sometimes I listen to, for instance, a lot of field recordings,
mm-hmm,
uh, and it's something I failed to mention earlier, but something my brother and I got really into was field recordings, and there's something called the Art of Field Recordings, which came out a few years ago, which is by a guy named Art somebody out of Georgia. Anyway, who was sort of an unknown until now field recording guy, like an Alan Lomax, but a little
mm,
modern day. But anyway, I got so much out of these things, including the Alan Lomax stuff. Um, and you're listening to people that are not household names usually, except for Lead Belly or something like that. But then there's all kinds of things that are even more recent, like 60s, 70s field recording. Arnold
mm-hmm,
Burnside would be somebody to recognize, but there's a lot of people you don't recognize, and I have definitely learned like guitar things from them or been influenced by the singing and
mm-hmm.
composition wise. I'm going to use that riff from that or whatever. And I've lost track of a lot of people that have influenced me, and I've had it pointed out to me, which recently, which was kind of
Oh,
embarrassing. And um, I have a song called "Postcards from Hell"
mm-hmm,
that that I learned. I think I told you earlier. I was really into this African
mm-hmm.
guitar video, right? And it has all these different guitar players, and I don't remember their names or know anything about them, sadly. But there was one guy that I took a lick from, and I put it in that song, and I butchered the lick. I can't even play it like he is, but in the same way that I've stolen, all of us have taken B.B.
Oh
King
yeah.
licks or Robert Johnson. I did that, and I
Mm-hmm.
put it in a song, and which I don't think there's anything wrong with that because
No.
that's what happens. But somebody emailed me who knew who knew the origins of that riff and said, "Hey, aren't you going to give Daniel Kachamba some credit?" And I was
Oh,
like,
that's why you remember his name
I don't know
earlier.
who that is. Yeah, and that's where so I'm trying to be a little more careful now because I'm happy to not like I make money on that song, but I do play it for people, and they're like, "Good job, good song." So I would love to be able to say, "Yeah, I learned this from this riff anyway. This one part is influenced by Daniel Kachamba." So now I try to mention that guy's name because he was a big influence, and I didn't even know it. I
Yeah.
didn't know who he was. He was just another amazing guy that so sunk in here.
I think that's, yeah, the way that you've gone about it so far is, nobody can fault you for taking bits and pieces. And I think if you can use your platform once you get one to
Yeah,
better the people that you've taken from his lives, if you whatever mention it during shows or, you post or whatever like that, I think that goes a long way for sure. And
oh,
um,
absolutely, absolutely.
yeah.
No, and in that case, also, it's ironic because the guy I wrote that song about a guy who was one of my musical heroes in Atlanta, who uh, was somebody who died without a lot of people knowing who he was, and he didn't have any money, uh, and never got enough credit himself. So I wrote a song about a guy like that, having borrowed a musical idea from a guy like that. So, and when
Mhm.
I say a guy like that, it's a guy like any of us. It's like we're just doing the best we can, and so
Do you want to play another song that maybe some things you stole from somebody? And
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I will. I don't know if your people would be interested in this, but you as a guitar player, I have this weird guitar here. It's an old Stella from the 30s.
Yes, I have a 20 Stella. It's a resonator, not like that one though.
Yeah, and this one,
It's
I don't
gorgeous.
know that there's anything special about it, but I modified it, which is an idea I stole from somebody too. And there's a guy in Los Angeles who helped me with this, but put a rubber bridge on here. So anyway, it has this weird sound, especially when you play it through an amp. It's got an old Tedeschi pickup.
Can I hear it without the amp real quick?
Yes. The idea of the rubber bridge and also the flat wound strings is that there's no sustain.
So it's nice and short. Yeah.
It just kind of dies, but it's almost like it's almost classical sounding when it's not plugged in.
Yeah.
But really mellow, quiet. And
I love that.
Sustain.
Mm-hmm.
So, normally what guitar players are going for is as much sustain as possible. So,
right.
Kind of like we talked about earlier, it's kind of fun just to go the opposite direction. So even playing slide,
it just dies. It's a quick curve on that one.
Yeah. All right, so this is a song I've always liked, and I learned. I think there's all kinds of different versions of it, but I learned I first heard it and learned a version that was kind of like by Blind Willie McTell.
Mm-hmm.
And it's called Climbing High Mountains. I think it's also been called Higher Mountains. There's versions of Aretha Franklin singing it, but that's a little bit different. That's a little more modern. So anyway, this is the cheapo guitar version. I've been climbing high mountains trying to get home. I've been climbing high mountains trying to get home. I've been climbing high mountains. I've been climbing high mountains. I've been climbing high mountains trying to get home. I've been bearing the names of many trying to get home. I've been bearing the names of many trying to get home. I've been bearing the names of many, yeah. I've been bearing the names of many. I've been bearing the names of many trying to get home. Trying to get home. I've been climbing high mountains trying to get home. Yeah, I've been climbing high mountains. I've been climbing high mountains. I've been climbing high mountains trying to get home. I've been climbing high mountains. Yeah, I've been climbing high mountains. I've been climbing high mountains trying to get home. I've been climbing high mountains trying to get home.
I like the way that guitar sounds through that little amp.
It's quirky. It sounds a little broken. But.
Yeah, I mean, that's, part of the emotional quality we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, exactly.
So this podcast aims to bridge the gap for people who otherwise may not be exposed to old music. If you had to pick one musician, and this could be very hard or could be easy, as a gateway to music of the past, who would it be and why? And I can give you an example if you want.
I'll take an example just for the heck of it.
So here, like we said earlier, hearing Sister Rosetta Tharpe kind of brought me into not only rock and roll itself and going forward, and then it took me going backwards, because if you listen to her first record, her first two records, it's just her and the guitar, and it sounds very ragtime, Piedmont blues, slash rock and roll, kind of a mixture of all that. And then I kind of jumped backwards, a decade to 1930s, 1920s, and found Mississippi John Hurt and people like that.
Yeah.
So she was kind of my gateway drug, you could say,
Okay.
to that sort of music.
Yeah, yeah. Gosh, I gotta say, a few come to mind. For guitar, for me, it's definitely it's a little more modern, but it's Taj Mahal. Like Taj Mahal is the one who I found, led me back to a lot of stuff, at least guitar wise. So, but also like in a way, Ray Charles somehow, in just maybe even more in a pop music way, or I mean, at some point you could have called him pop or at least R&B, but he became internationally known, for playing country music and
Right.
jazz and everything. But that's another one who's really interesting. Is whether you're talking about singing or music in general or piano playing, who you could follow back, and there's roots in gospel and jazz and blues, and then he kind of came and turned it into just him. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I think on all kinds of different scales, that's what most of my heroes, or all of our heroes, do to some degree, right? Like you said, even Sister Rosetta Tharpe, she comes from all these certain traditions that so whether you're moving forward or backwards, you can see that the end result is this person creates a recipe of their own, and it's them. We recognize it right away.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that having a conglomerate makes you obviously the more you have in your little cup as far as genres go, and people that drink from that cup, they're going to taste different things in different genres themselves. So I think Ray Charles is a really good one too, to branch off into blues, jazz, country music. Even, I mean, you can even get into some early folk recordings from his stuff too.
Yeah.
Another question. So if you had to pick a time period of 10 to 20 years of music culture as your favorite or your most influenced by, what would it be?
It's a tough one. Maybe, how about 55 to 75?
All right.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, I don't know. Something about I think it has partly to do with the technology of recording music was exciting. I got really into like the Sam Phillips biography, or the guy who had Sun Studios, and just interesting in reading about Atlantic Records and some great records that were made in all styles of music, Frank Sinatra records, jazz records. So I like how the technology sounded and evolved in that time period, because it was all still analog and affected the sound of the recordings, and in turn affected the style people would emulate too. So that's a great question. I hadn't thought of it before. What would you pick? What's yours?
Yeah, it's even harder when you turn the tables. I actually haven't thought about it.
But you're on the spot.
I would say if I was going to pick 20 years, probably oh man, 1930, 1950. You're kind of at the tail end of, you're missing Mississippi John Hurt by about 2 years, but you got a lot of Reverend Gary Davis in there. You've got Woody Guthrie recordings, some of his first, I believe. You've got early Pete Seeger recordings. Yeah, it's kind of the spark of what would become the folk revival and the blues revival started happening right about 1950 or 1949. So I would say, yeah, that. Thanks for asking.
Cool. Now you know, and now I know.
Right.
Cool.
Not if anybody else asks me.
I just think I've nerded out over enough stuff where like it's interesting to me too, like how recording of music. You know, I mean, for one thing, it'd be cool to go back before music was recorded. What was it like? Because the recording of music affected how people played music. You know
right.
what I mean? And like, you know, if you think about it, like before there was recorded music, there was no such thing as like we wouldn't scrutinize. For instance, we were talking about tuning, right? And like tuning, like I think I've read that the theory is that tuning was less important before you listened back to something. You know, you experienced music differently. You don't experience music anymore, or the only thing you could experience was either to read it off of a sheet or to be there. When you were there, it's not going to be. It's gone. It happens. It's a moment and it's gone.
Right.
Maybe it is out of tune. But then when people started, I think I read a theory. I can't remember where I read this, but theory that once music was recorded and people heard back things that were out of tune, that's when they started, like, that's when vibrato was created.
Really?
It's an interesting idea because people started, you know, they would just sing, ah, you know, the whole ah, or string players, you know, violin players playing with vibrato. Became a lot more important when like tuning became more important when it was like music could be reproduced, right? So there was just a different emphasis on it. You know, maybe it's not that big a deal until something like that happens. So.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that because if you get tuned into, if your ears get conditioned to hear what music is supposed to sound like, or if it's supposed to be in this tune or this key or whatever it is, then you know, inevitably before that, people probably didn't care as much because they weren't conditioned to believe that or to hear that.
Yeah.
It's an interesting theory. I like that.
It's really interesting. And I don't know if I read that in the. Did you read the David Byrne book? Do you know about the David Byrne?
I heard about it. I haven't read it yet.
Works. There's some great stuff in there that just things that are intuitive, but you don't think of them, like how people create music for, you know, at least subconsciously, when you create music, you're thinking about where is it going to be played and listened to, and that affects how you do it. So if you know you're going to be in a stadium, well, you're not going to be real subtle and do really subtle little quiet sensitive things. You have to be kind of bold and make bold moves if you're going to be U2 or something like that in a stadium. Or like if you're playing really rhythmically complicated music, you know, like African drum music, well, it comes from being outdoors. There's no reverberance in a room. Like you couldn't do that in a church; it would just be a mess. You know?
Right.
So he makes this point that, and I think it's fascinating. I never thought of that. But there are things like that that influence how music is created and composed.
Sort of environmental conditioning of some sort, preconditioning. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And
that's weird.
It's weird.
You're probably the third or fourth person in the last week or two to mention that book, or the last 2 weeks to mention that book. And I need to get my hands on it once I get some time. Whenever that is. Good Lord.
That book, it's a good read.
So do you have, are you aware of any artists today that are keeping true to American roots music, or, you know, perhaps reviving it in some way? It could be a specific style of blues, country, folk music, whatever you want to.
By that, do you mean they're strictly traditional, or
Not strictly traditional, but maybe that could be it could be strictly traditional, or it could be maybe they're expounding on it, but it's recognizable as pioneer sound.
yeah? Well, I really like Valerie June.
Mm-hmm.
Her, um, she comes to mind. Um, Kind of drawing a blank at the moment, but Valerie June comes to mind in terms of sort of having a deep rooted. I don't know. I just hear some deep roots in there.
Yeah,
But
she's
again,
got a
she's got such a unique voice that
yeah, it is unique, and but there is some. She has elements that she's definitely preserving.
yeah,
Um,
yeah, it just sounds like from a different time. Even when she's making a modern sounding recording,
yes,
she sounds like she comes from a different era.
maybe that's how I should ask the question, because I've asked this a couple times and I need to phrase it like that. Like, who is somebody that can transport you to a different time that's playing
Ah,
today?
yeah.
Like Blind Boy Paxton. Do you know Blind Boy Paxton or John Paxton?
Oh, I've heard that name, but I don't know who that is.
You should look him up.
Okay.
He's kind of he's not kind of he's incredible in the sense of the transportation into a different era for sure. But he plays I think 5 or 6 instruments fluently, but he's also a songster. So he does ragtime, he does straight blues, he does Appalachian folk music, he does kind of the full um, entourage of heritages that he kind of can draw from, even like gypsy jazz, Louisiana Creole stuff. Um, but he's he's like 23 or 24 years old or something like that.
Wow.
And he's only legally blind. He's not actually blind, but Blind
Cool.
Boy
Awesome.
Paxton,
Blind Boy
or
Paxton. I'll check
yeah,
him out.
look him up. What have you been up to lately that you want to talk about? This is a shameless plugs section.
Oh, well, I did take the opportunity to during the lockdown to make an album, make a solo album, something I never had time to do before. I've always been in bands and sort of wrapped up in that, and dabbled in little solo, collaborations with. And when I say solo, I mean just something outside of for me, the Wood Brothers right now.
Mm-hmm.
It's been between that and raising a family. That's kept me really busy, and most of my collaborating was within the Wood Brothers. So
Mm-hmm.
so I started collaborating with some folks a little bit before the album, before I even knew I was making an album, and before that I knew there was going to be a pandemic. And I had no plans on making an album. I just was having fun, meeting new people, and reuniting with old people. And just when people would come through Nashville, I'd say, "Hey, let's write a song," or "Let's go in the studio and just jam and see what happens."
Mm-hmm.
Um, so by the time the pandemic hit, I had a few things like that in the can, that either in the can or in that means recorded. Um, but I had them like either half written or completely recorded, or I had a few things, and then I got inspired in my free time to write and keep collaborating with some friends, and then before long I was like, I just about got enough songs for an album. Let's write a couple. I'll write a couple more, and just that'll be what I do this year. And so really it just came out of convenience, and I wasn't originally inspired to do that, but it's just a fun thing to keep me busy for the year, and it's not something that had a lot of thought put into it. It's more like just play music and record it until there's an album worth, and then
Mm-hmm.
put it out before we get back on tour, which it comes out um, in another couple weeks, and then I go on tour with the Wood Brothers and starting in June.
Awesome.
Got it in under the nick of time.
And the two that you played are on that record, yeah.
They are the Needed Time song is kind of a bonus track, so it's not on. It's on the streaming version of the album, I guess. But,
Okay.
yeah.
Excellent. I'll link all that stuff in the description for folks that want to check in with that.
Awesome.
And this will probably release in like 2 weeks anyway, so it might be around the time. I'll try to maybe time it with your release too.
Yeah, I think the release is the 21st, if I'm not mistaken.
Okay, wonderful. And last question.
Yeah.
Something I like to ask everybody: do you have a message that you want to send out regarding all the deep changes going on in the world? And this doesn't have to tie into music.
Oh gosh, stay connected.
Mm-hmm.
Stay connected. I'll come back to that.
I love that. Thank you so much for all your time today, Arlo. It was really a pleasure.
Fun.
Yeah.
Enjoyed it, Nicholas. Enjoyed talking to you.
You too.
All right. Later, man.
See you later. All right.
All right.
So,